Greetings and welcome to this month's EHF Live Investor Session. Edmund Hillary Fellowship. It's a collective of entrepreneurs, scientists, storytellers, creatives and investment change makers who want to make an impact globally from Aotearoa, New Zealand. So hopefully these informal investor interviews are planned in a way that when you leave here after the 60 minutes or so, you feel you know the investor fellows on a personal level and understand what their intentions are for New Zealand. Now this month you will hear from Ed Baker and EHF Investor Fellow as he is interviewed by Mark Pavlyukovskyy, founder of NZVC. So it is a Q&A session. So firstly, there will be Q&A from Mark to Ed, and then we will open up the floor and then you can ask questions also. You can either put them in the chat or you can just raise your hand and Mark can ask them. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Michelle. Great to have everybody here, and I'm pretty excited to be interviewing Ed today. So I'll give you a quick intro on Ed, and then we can dive in. So Ed studied at Harvard and later Stanford, and while at Stanford, he actually took the famous BJ Fogg Facebook apps class, which was class designed solely to creating apps on Facebook right when their API became public. And so the idea of the class was to make a viral app. So Ed was one of the lucky few, actually there were quite a few folks who made apps that got over 1 million users, and kind of you can actually read in the New York Times, some of these folks got profiled. So it was basically, he was a student who created a viral app, over 1 million users, and eventually that led to him starting his first company, which was then acquired by Facebook. Given that his focus had been on growth and viral tactics and marketing, he led Facebook's global growth right as they were having kind of one of their biggest growth spurts to date internationally. And then after a few years at at Facebook, he actually knew Travis Kalanick at Uber and joined Uber right as that company was getting ready to have an exponential growth phase, and basically led Uber's international growth. After Uber, his dad actually told him that he, after working so hard at Uber, he's working, 15-hour days from what I gather. His dad told him he was like in the worst shape of his life, and so I decided to, focus on that as a problem and became a triathlete. He had done some track in college. Had never really done any biking or swimming. He learned biking. He learned how to swim really well, and 18 months later won his first triathlon. And so, sort of somewhere in between that, he had 3 kids, and actually back in February of 2020, he was one of the first people, I think, publicly to start saying that COVID was probably already in the U.S. and spreading, which was really interesting. His connection to New Zealand, he's actually invested in a couple of companies here. He's on the board of Crimson Education, and is also an investor and on the board of NZVC, which is our investment firm here in New Zealand. He's recently got into crypto investing and Web3, and several of his friends like Jack Herrick and Naval Ravikant have also gotten involved with the fund with that's help. So that's a bit about Ed. And Ed, I'd love to just start off by kind of learning more about your childhood. How did you grow up? Kind of what were your parents like? What kind of gave you the inspiration to kind of go do all these very interesting things that you've done throughout your career?
Sure. And thanks for that intro, Mark. There are things you said that I haven't even thought about for a while. I'm not sure how you even got all that information, but that's awesome. So let's see, where do I start? What was it like growing up? I guess I'll just start by saying I was born in Seattle. My family then moved to Taiwan for a couple of years. So my first memories are actually from when we were living in Taiwan. And apparently I was speaking some Mandarin at the same time I was learning English. Wow. We then moved to the Bay Area when I was 5. And that's where I grew up until the age of 13, at which point we moved to Jacksonville, Florida, which was a pretty big change from Palo Alto, California to Jacksonville.
Why were you moving around so much?
My dad just had different jobs, and I think the hardest move for me was the one to Florida. And I think part of the reason we made that move, I didn't really realize it at the time because I was 13 years old, but I think my parents just felt like there was so much pressure in Silicon Valley, even back then. This was in the, around 1992. And they just felt like we had to get out of there.
Wow.
And so we moved to Jacksonville, Florida, where my mom was born and raised. And so I think my dad was in the Navy when he was stationed in Jacksonville. That's where he met my mom. And so for them, they had all these good memories of like, this is the place where we met. And I think it just felt like that would be a fun place to go. But for me and my brother, who was 2 years younger than me, it was hard to leave all of our friends in California and start a new life in Florida at that age.
Yeah.
Let's see. I wasn't really. I'm kind of talking all over the place right now.
Do you think that the moving around, do you think that influenced you like in a positive or negative way?
Good question. I think ultimately it was positive, but it was really hard at the time. I mean, I remember when I think it's probably hard at age 13 to, no, even if you don't move, that's a hard age. But moving across the country before internet was around to message your friends was especially hard. I remember my parents would let me, I could call one friend a month for like 5 minutes because it was so expensive to do a long distance phone call, and I would write letters to some of my friends, it just did. I for the first 6 months I lived in Florida, I cried myself to sleep every night. I really missed California.
Wow.
It was tough, but now looking back, I think it made me more resilient. The school I went to in Florida, I went to a public school in California, and in Jacksonville, Florida, I went to a private school, and that was a big change. I had to wear a tie every day, and I remember kids making fun of my ties, and I just felt like I didn't really fit in. And I was also I think what I had been studying in California, we were a bit ahead of where the kids were in Florida. So I took some classes with some of the kids that were a grade ahead of me, and people were like, oh, this nerdy guy is taking these more advanced classes. And so I just was not a very popular kid. And it was tough. I was trying to find my place and didn't really feel like I fit in.
Did your folks ever say let's move back, or did you ever say let's move back?
I think a lot of the stuff I didn't realize until I kind of became an adult. But I think for my dad especially, it was he didn't have great experience out in the Bay Area, and I think it was a difficult time in his life, and so that was never really an option that was on the table. And when you're a kid, you kind of just go along with whatever your parents do, I think, right? Or at least that's what I did. So I didn't even really think of it as an option. So it took me a while to I never fully felt like I fit in at my high school in Florida, but I did discover track as kind of an extracurricular activity, track and cross country running. And I felt like that more than anything made me feel like, okay, now I have a group of friends and I started to feel like I'd found my place a little bit more. So just discovering a sport I found was really helpful back then.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Nice. That's awesome. And then what kind of happened after that?
So after that, I ended up applying to colleges and decided to go to Harvard and studied physics and chemistry there. At Harvard, I felt much more, I don't know, it was a refreshing change from Jacksonville, Florida. And I made a lot of friends there. I ran on the track and cross country team there, and athletics ended up being a pretty big part of my college experience. You know, I kind of thought like, oh, that's just a high school thing. In college, I'm going to study and not worry about athletics. But I realized that that I just really enjoyed that, and I enjoyed the balance between kind of academics and athletics, the balance that provided, and it was a bit of an escape for me too, because Harvard was a pretty like intense place, and a bit of a pressure cooker at times. So it was nice to have a sport I could do to kind of help me relieve some of that stress. Let's see. So in college, I made some of my closest friends today are still friends from college. So it was a pretty, those 4 years were pretty meaningful for me. And I also started my first company while I was there.
Wow.
I don't know if you could really call it a company, actually. It was, at the time I thought I was starting a company, but it was really just a website. Back when websites were kind of this new thing. It was called datesite.com. And the way it worked was you would put in email addresses of people you had a crush on, and they would get an email saying somebody likes you. And then it said, go to datesite.com to see if there's a match. And you'd go there and you'd have to type in email addresses of people you had a crush on. And if it matched up, it would say, hey, you guys have a match, you should go out.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, part of the reason I built it was I was too shy to actually ask anyone out to their face. And so I partially built it for myself, although I don't think I ended up getting any matches, but, you know, I tried. But within 1 week, a quarter of all the students at Harvard had signed up for it.
Wow.
And that just blew my mind. This was back in 1999.
Wow.
And people were just starting to use the internet. And this was back when like people actually would read an email saying someone has a crush on you, and it wouldn't go into your spam folder because their spam folders didn't even really exist back then.
Right.
So it was a different time back then, but I was just blown away by how quickly it grew on its own. And I was, you know, studying physics at the time, so I was really interested in the math behind that viral growth. And that's when I first started to experiment with this idea of viral growth on the internet, and the fact that it can actually be measured, and you can run experiments, you know, just like you might run a physics experiment. You could run an experiment on the internet and say, well, what if we tweak the email to say this instead of this? You know, how does that change the conversion rate? And what if we change this page to, you know, say this instead of this? And how does that change things? And then with all these experiments, kind of seeing, well, does that allow us to grow faster? So it was kind of something I just stumbled upon.
Did you start running those experiments right at that time?
Not right away, but I at first, when I first launched it, it just happened to be viral from day one. Although that was at Harvard campus, it maybe tells you something about Harvard students, the fact that they all wanted to like put in crushes and not actually tell people. It was also
probably worked better at MIT, right?
Yeah, it went viral at MIT as well, actually. That was our second school. So I did more experimentation later on. I went out to Stanford for business school, and yeah, as you mentioned, that's when I took the Facebook class. And at that point in time, I was starting to do a lot more of those experiments.
And you were at Harvard before Zuck was there, right?
That's right. I graduated, I think, a year before he started. So I think he was 5 years.
Do you think there was something special at Harvard at the time that led to, well, it sounds like you got a lot of really interesting experiences with viral growth, and he later did with Facebook. Do you think there was something special at Harvard at the time that led to that being kind of, in some ways, yeah, like, you know, a lot of innovation kind of flourishing there?
Good question. I don't know. I think think it might just be a coincidence. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm trying to think if there was anything in particular. I mean, well, so the reason I actually built the site was there was this business plan competition, and my roommates and I at dinner one night were brainstorming like, well, what we should apply for this business plan competition. If we win, we can make some money. It'd be cool. And we're like, well, what would the business idea be? And that's when I came up with the idea for DateSite. We ended up writing a business plan, submitting it. We ended up not winning anything. Our idea was not selected, but we liked the idea so much. We were like, let's build it anyway, you know? So I remember going to the bookstore and buying a book to learn how to code. And so I could code the site myself.
Wow.
I
That's
coded
funny.
it in, I mean, it was not very pretty. I remember using, I think, C++ and CGI scripts, and I was learning all this stuff for the first time.
Wow. Cool. And then you said, that's awesome. Thank you. And then you went to Stanford, and that's where you sort of really got into the growth stuff.
Yeah, that's where, when Facebook launched their app platform in 2007, that was a great way to experiment with these growth ideas by building different apps. And, one of the apps I built in that class you mentioned that BJ Fogg taught was, it was called Send Hotness. And you'll see a common theme with some of these things I worked on. It would let you send hotness points to people friends of yours you thought were hot. And that, it was just a silly little, you probably remember the days of those crazy Facebook apps that all were growing virally. So this one grew to 5 million users in 5 weeks.
Wow. 5 million users in 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Mark, you
do
wanted
you
to
have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to make a comment to the question that Mark asked earlier about whether there's something unique happening at Harvard. I was there before you,
Okay.
graduated in, I hate to admit this, actually in the earlier century, in 1978. And even then, there was a lot of encouragement to do things, and a lot of things that were probably not a great idea at the time. I mean, I was in physics, and we were basically given free run of the lab, and we did a lot of stuff that was, in hindsight, probably very dangerous, but that was okay. And I think later, because I was there overlapping with Bill Gates, and he and his buddies took over the computer center and basically built their whole product on Harvard's system. Presumably when you built your app, it was also probably on Harvard's systems, totally in violation of the rules.
That's right.
And probably between the two of you, because it was probably in the late 80s or early 90s, no, it was later than that, would have been the early to mid 90s. I got pulled into something that was a workshop or a program that Harvard was looking at, is how do we use technology? So they brought a bunch of alumni in, and we looked at it, and they were actually thinking of suing Microsoft. They thought they could get, a few $100 million from Microsoft because he had violated the terms of use, and therefore, when they built their initial basic interpreter, it was illegal and all this. And we talked them out of that, which in hindsight, Harvard got a lot more money from both Microsoft and Bill Gates and various other alumni who had been there. But it was really, I think that was the thing that allowed people like you or Zuck or others to do things. It was encouraged to try stuff more so than a lot of other campuses.
That's a great point, Mark. Now that you say it, that resonates with me. And I was trying to think though, like who encouraged people to do so? Where did that come from? And, like you said, it was actually against the university rules to start a company while you were there. So it wasn't that the university was actively encouraging students to start companies, but I'd say it was almost from my peers. Like when my roommates and I were brainstorming over dinner, and we're just like, let's do this. It
was that. And I think Harvard believes in free range students. They say they have rules, but actually it's free range. You do whatever you want. And that's the way they treat their academics largely. You get out of it what you put in. If you don't put something in, they don't come and help you.
Yep. True.
Oh,
thanks for that comment.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Mark. Thank you.
So where were we, Mark?
You were saying you grew to 5 million in 5 weeks.
5 million in 5 weeks.
So this was Send Hotness at Stanford?
It was called Send Hotness, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And our professor said, your grade will be based on how many users your app has. So
really?
we, yeah, it didn't
Was there a
matter if
minimum?
we,
Was there like a minimum that you had to have?
I don't know if there was a minimum, but I think
Because if you have like, 5 million and everyone else has 1,000, right? Then
right. Yeah.
how do you
I don't
standardize the
know.
grading?
I know that I got a good grade in the class, even though I didn't do the homework.
Nice. So this was what, like almost 7 years after your experiment at Harvard, right?
That's right. So I kind of skipped over the 5 years between college and business school, where I was in Boston. Most of that time I worked at Bain Consulting and Bain Capital Private Equity. Most of that time in Boston, but spent a year in Tokyo as well.
I guess, yeah, I'm
And-
interested because it was like, it's been 5 years. So like the internet had grown pretty fast since then, right? So did you find that it was the same
Yeah.
tactics that worked both kind of before,
Yeah,
or-
it was the same framework, but there were slightly different, I guess, same framework and similar tactics, but the biggest thing that changed were the actual growth channels. So by the time I was out at Stanford, email wasn't working anymore. For some of those reasons I mentioned, just like spam filters and people just not reading their emails as much as they used to.
Right.
So actually, when I was at Stanford Business School, another thing I did before Facebook built that platform was I built a mobile version of datesite.com, and I still had the domain name. I just did it with text messaging, and that went viral. And with that one, I did do a lot more of the A/B testing and experiments and that kind of thing. And then, of course, with the Facebook platform, those growth channels were things that all existed within the Facebook platform itself. So things like sending invites and notifications and things via Facebook. So I'd say that was the biggest thing that changed. And I think that still is like the thing that's constantly changing is the actual growth channels that are most effective change over time. But I think the framework stays the same, and I like to kind of draw out a viral loop. Anytime I'm trying to make a new product grow in a viral way, the first thing I do is just draw out a simple viral loop and think about, it starts with, how does someone who's never heard of this product before get pulled into it and sign up for it and use it, and then ultimately share it with their friends so that their friends get pulled into it and the loop repeats. So you can kind of just like draw out the steps that what has to happen between the first user using something and the next person who heard about it from them using it. And you can measure every step of that loop to kind of see what your K factor is. And if that K factor gets above 1, that's when you see massive exponential growth. And by the way, that's the main reason you mentioned the pandemic. And I wrote a Medium post, a couple of Medium posts about it. I think, yeah, as Michelle's saying, that's the R. That's the R naught is the same thing as the K factor. And the math is exactly the same. And so I think, I may have written my first blog post about it in January, I think, before people were still saying, no, it's not going to be in the US. But just from all the data I had seen from China and pattern matching that with all these viral experiments I'd run over the last 20 years, it just struck me that this is the exact same pattern, and there's no way this thing is going to be contained to China or any other part of the world. And the blog post I wrote.
That's when you applied to EHF, right? To move to New Zealand?
That's right.
Sorry, but go, yeah, the blog post, right?
Oh yeah, I just made all of the analogies between like how you calculate a K factor when you're trying to make something on the internet grow in a viral way, and the R naught with COVID. And it was kind of a weird exercise for me to go through, because I had always been trying to do things and run experiments to increase the K factor, right? Because you always want to grow faster. But then for the first time, as I was writing these blog posts, I was thinking about, well, how do you effectively reduce that effective R, right? And that's why I also wrote a follow-up post about face masks back when the CDC was still saying no one needs to wear face masks. I was gonna, this is the only thing I can think of that might reduce our K factor. So there were just a lot of analogies that struck me, and that's why I started writing about it. Although I'm by no means an epidemiologist or anything like that. I just wanted to share some of my observations.
Yeah, and then back to Facebook. So at that time, there was a lot of companies that were taking off just based on Facebook. It sounded like they built inherently to the product, baked in a bunch of these viral kind of tools, right? So like Zynga took off, and like a bunch of companies kind of became really huge. And then when Facebook, on the flip side, turned those things off, right? Zynga tanked, and a lot of other companies kind of went bust. Right. So kind of, can you talk a bit about that like period, and what was Facebook trying to leverage other products to grow, and then at some point they decided that was kind of, they were taking them too much space, and it was time to close them down. And then what was your role, kind of, because you had a company, you got acquired?
That's right. Yeah. So I did build. I started a company after business school called Friendly, friend.ly, which we built on Facebook's platform. So we were using all of those Facebook channels to grow, and we were able to grow to over 25 million registered users doing so. But I always felt vulnerable. I always felt like Facebook could shut these things off at any time, and then we wouldn't be able to grow anymore. And that is what happened with companies like Zynga, So I think that was the biggest risk at the time. The same way that, email used to work, and then with spam filters and stuff, like people stopped seeing the emails, and it's harder to keep that K factor high. With Facebook, I think Facebook it was kind of like the Wild West. And for a while they were just kind of letting anything go. And then I remember there was one app I built called Zodiac Photo Album that basically it would just look at all of your friends on Facebook and create a photo album for every zodiac sign, and it would show you which of your friends had that zodiac sign. It'd have one for Aries, one for etc. And then it would tag all those friends. And it was actually the most viral thing I had ever built. And within
while you were at Facebook or outside?
No, this was before I was at Facebook. Okay. This was actually when I was starting up Friendly. This was something I built right before that.
Got it.
It was super viral, but within 48 hours, we got shut down because we had tagged, I think, like over 100 million people in photos on Facebook, including Mark Zuckerberg. Was tagged in some. And this was back when they had this highlight section that would show, popular photos on Facebook from your friends. And like all of the highlights were all Zodiac photo albums. It just kind of broke the site for a day. And wow. I later found out that Zuckerberg said to the platform team, "What is this Zodiac photo album thing? And why are we allowing this on here?" And then they just shut it off. Even though we hadn't technically broken any of the rules. I said, "Why did you guys shut us down?" And they just said, I said, "Did we violate any of your platform policies?" And it took them a while to get back to me. And they finally said, "Well, it violates the spirit of the Facebook platform." So anyways, it was the Wild West, but we were always at the mercy of like Facebook's channels and whether or not they wanted to keep those going. So, I think these days it's interesting. I feel like a lot of apps are figuring out other ways to grow. Like, I think SMS is still a pretty popular one. And especially with smartphones and the way you can import your address book, like Clubhouse, for example, used that. And I think was able to grow really quickly just through doing the address book importer thing pretty well. So there's still, and those are ways that I think are safer to grow because you don't have a company like Facebook that can just turn it off.
I mean, with a lot of
So I
these
guess
things,
you do
like,
have Apple could turn it off
when
potentially.
we talk about some of these tactics, right? Like importing the address book, for example, I think every single app tries to do that, right? Yet some
Yeah.
apps succeed and some don't. So like when you
Sure.
think about the viral loop, how do you think of like, sure, like I think the tactics are, every tactic is available to every company. What makes certain companies stand out?
Yeah. So yeah, the interesting thing about making something kind of hit that tipping point and start growing exponentially is it's all about getting that K factor above 1. And even if you're just below 1 at like 0.9, you won't have any exponential growth. Whereas if you're at 1.1, that can just compound so quickly and grow so much. And so, sure, everyone's trying to do things like add an address book importer and do these different things. And that might help you get some virality, but unless you're really measuring the K factor and iterating on it and running experiments, you're probably not going to hit that tipping point. So, and that's a pretty hard thing to do, is to hit that tipping point. And I think it's only gotten harder over time. And at the end of the day, it actually takes, I think, a lot more art than science to get there these days. So I don't think you can just kind of experiment your way to getting something to go viral these days. I think you have to really be creative and think about what are the things that are going to make people want to share this product and want to sign up for this product. So that the art, I think, is actually like more important. In 20 years ago, I think you could just take a very scientific approach and almost like brute force it to get going viral. But these days, I think it's actually, you have to build a better product. It's a lot harder to make something go viral that isn't a good product.
Right. And so,
by the way, I saw a couple of questions might have come in. Like, does it make sense now to look at any of those, or?
I think we've addressed.
I think there was one. I just briefly saw it pop up about maybe giving an example of a viral loop. Did Sean ask?
Yeah, I mean, I can read it to you basically and just ask you.
Yeah.
What it is. So, I mean, I had a business that was viral and grew, but, when I started in 2011, Facebook, it was kind of super easy to do. And then with their algorithm changes and also with Google changing their algorithm all the time, it gets more and more difficult. So, with Uber or even something that you're working on now, or if you're investing in a company, are there certain ways, like importing address books, some more concrete examples that, some of the entrepreneurs or investors here could use with their portfolio companies to say, hey, here are some things like a referral program or anything that you kind of like map out a viral loop. Like how did Uber kind of get off the ground and get that factor up?
So referral programs are a very common viral loop. And a lot of times there's more than one viral loop in a product, and sometimes you need multiple viral loops all kind of working together to get your overall K factor above 1. But with Uber, the referral program was and probably still is a big part of their growth, and that's the give a ride, get a ride. When I first joined Uber, I think it was give $20, get $20, and so you could kind of give a new user. You give any of your friends $20 worth of credit on Uber. Once they signed up and claimed that and took their first ride, you'd get $20 of credit to your account. We then tested out different versions of that and found that give a ride, get a ride was more viral because I think people that received those free rides, for whatever reason, valued that more, or were more likely to sign up when they received it, even though the average ride costs less than $20. So that was a great discovery when we found we can spend less money and grow faster when we switch it from give 20, get 20 to give a ride, get a ride. So that was one example of something we did at Uber to increase the virality. That was on the rider side. On the driver side, we had a driver referral program as well. And we found that we were actually more supply constrained than demand constrained at Uber. Anytime you have a two-sided marketplace, usually one side of that marketplace is where you're constrained. And with Uber in most markets, it was that we were constrained on the supply side. So when we realized that, and it took us a while to really fully realize that, then it became all about how do we get more drivers on the platform? That's the key to unlocking growth. So there was the driver referral program where drivers could refer other drivers, but we thought there've got to be other ways to get new drivers on the platform. And one of the things we did, this is a super simple tweak we made to the app, but when I look back at my time, both at Facebook and at Uber and at other companies I've worked with, there's often like one thing per year we do that moves the needle on growth more than everything else combined. And a lot of times it's a pretty simple thing. So I'll share with you the example at Uber. We added the ability for riders to sign up and become drivers. We just added a little button in the rider app saying, hey, would you like to become a driver? And suddenly that gave us more new drivers signing up than like all of our paid marketing on the driver's side. So, and it took a week to do that, a week of engineering time to add a little button and make the sign up flow work for riders to become drivers. We called it R2D, rider to driver. And that was a huge needle mover for us for the overall company. And, you know, we were running dozens of experiments a week and had, at that point in time, hundreds of people on the growth team and doing all kinds of things, looking for 1% improvement here or there. And then it's like, add a button in the rider app, asking riders to become drivers. And that like one thing we did caused more growth than everything else combined. So I feel like there was maybe one thing like that each year. And of course, you didn't always know ahead of time what that one thing would be, but it was always interesting when we discover like, wow, that one little feature was more important than everything else combined in terms of driving growth that year.
Ed, with a lot of these, you were early. And so for a lot of these, whether Facebook or Uber, being early allowed you to, you know, trial and error things and get to something that worked. Whereas now a lot of these have been tried. And, you know, one could argue that a lot of these big platforms, whether it's Google or Facebook, control, and Apple control the ecosystem. And so it's harder to break through, right? They either take a big tax or they limit how fast you can grow. How do you think about that? Like, do you think we sort of left, like Clubhouse may be an example of something that really broke out last year, but I feel like the frequency of those types of companies has become less and less frequent. Do you feel like that's true? Do you feel like there's now, I mean, because you have these sort of monopolies, it's harder for companies to break out? And if so, what are some of the new ways that they can try to, you know, are there new platforms and new mediums that would allow them to do so?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I sometimes feel what you're sharing, which is like, wow, all these big companies, they almost feel like monopolies now. And like, is it possible to create your own startup anymore? But then you look at like the number of unicorns that are created every year these days, like in the last year, it's like way more than ever before. So there are plenty of companies out there that are growing faster than what we've ever seen before. I do think that kind of the growth hacking, which is kind of what some of the stuff I've been talking about with measuring the K factor and running A/B tests and all of that, is, you know, probably less important today than it used to be. And I think the more important thing today is really just building a great product that people want to use and people want to pay for. I mean, that's the other thing. A lot of the stuff I worked on in the past it was all free. And so you had to grow to millions or tens of millions of users for it to really become a valuable business. Whereas today, I feel like there's so many more things people are willing to pay for. And I'm involved with a couple of subscription-based companies in the health and wellness space, both of whom are now unicorns, and they got to that milestone with just hundreds of thousands of subscribers. So you don't even need 1 million subscribers to, when you have people who are actually willing to pay for something. So I think that's maybe one of the differences today versus in the past, is that it's just like easier to get people to pay for things maybe. And therefore it's easier to build businesses that can, that can generate meaningful revenue like more easily.
Yeah, I think one of those companies is Whoop, right? And the
Yeah,
reason
for sure.
I found out about Whoop was because one of the other fellows, Yoav, who's on this call, he told me about it. He was wearing the band, right? So that was actually an interesting, viral transmission way of doing it, or actually a wearable that people ask you about. Because I asked him, "What is that?" He explained it to me, right? And then it became a thing that like other people ask you about. I mean,
That's right.
one of the things
EHF cohort 7 member Ryan McIntyre is on their board.
Yeah.
On Whoop board?
Yeah.
Ryan McIntyre?
What's the name of the company?
Whoop. I'm on Whoop's board, but I don't think
that's awkward for me, because that at least it's recorded that I'm wrong. Awesome.
No, I mean, maybe he's on their advisory board. I'm not sure if
he's definitely an investor in the company. So Foundry Group in Boulder.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So we'd have Foundry is like one of their biggest investor, actually.
And I kind of wanted to maybe 2 more things before we sort of have people a time lapse. One thing I wanted to talk about was definitely kind of New Zealand, your interest in New Zealand, and how founders here can think about growth. And the second thing was Web3, right? Because I think Web3 now is turning out to be, now it has a lot of different growth tactics that Web2 companies didn't really have. And, I'm happy to talk about what Web3 even is, or you can talk about that, but maybe those 2 things we can kind of cover before the end of the call, whichever way you want to take it.
Yeah, for sure. So let's see, Web3, and by the way, Foundry Group's one of the biggest investors. I just saw your note, but Chris Moody from Foundry is on the board, so he must be partner.
So he's the partner, and I think Ryan led the investment, and then Chris took the board.
Okay.
So I'm not totally wrong.
Okay, no, you're not. And so
it's somewhat vindicated.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, just quickly on Whoop before we move on to your question, Mark. One of the first suggestions I made when I joined the board of Whoop was a change to their pricing, which ultimately it was basically, instead of charging $180 upfront for the strap and getting 6 months free and then paying $30 a month, to just charge $30 a month from day one. And it's a very simple concept, but by reducing that friction of not having that huge upfront payment, and instead of just doing $30 a month, and we basically make you commit for 6 months, so we know we will get that $180. We saw twice as many people started purchasing Whoop just because of that one little change. So a lot of times,
how did you make them commit? They're only paying $30 a month.
The same way like a cell phone company will say, we'll give you an iPhone if you pay this much per month, but if you cancel early, you've got to pay us the difference.
Got it.
So, and that was the main reason Whoop hadn't done that, was they're like, well, the hardware is a lot more expensive than $30, so we can't just let you start paying $30 a month. But when we added that language around the commitment, it ended up working.
Yeah. But
So
and the way they position it now is you're paying for the service, right? You're paying for the monitoring the data, which
exactly,
which makes sense.
And you get free hardware upgrades by just being a member. So it really is more about being a member than a hardware sales business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Back to Web3, I have to say this is not an area where I have any, I consider myself to have any expertise. So I think the extent of my expertise is I was able to connect you, Mark, for other friends of mine who do have expertise in that area. And I kind of follow along and invest in some of the things they invest in. But I have to say that's just not something where I can speak with a whole lot of knowledge, but it is an area that's obviously going to be huge, and a place where I would like to learn more and spend some more time.
Yeah, and maybe I guess just for everyone who is not familiar, what Web3 is just it's the idea of using kind of blockchain technology for a lot of the applications that we use today, which are centralized and sort of Web2. And the reason I asked was because a lot of these projects are growing super fast. Part of the way they're able to do that is to incentivize with payment. Like they pay their users, right? So the model, instead of paying third party company to get the users, they actually pay the users directly. So I'm just curious if you have thought about that, how that changed some of the viral rules. But yeah, that's fine. And we can talk about New Zealand now, because I think you're also on on the board of Crimson, right? Which is a New Zealand company.
Yeah, I'm on their advisory board and an investor in the company. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so far, unfortunately, since we haven't yet had a chance to go there in person, everything I've been doing in terms of investing in companies in New Zealand has been through introductions and Zoom meetings, including through you, Mark. Mm-hmm. And so I'm excited for the time when I can actually go and meet some of these founders in person. But in terms of like, how do I decide on what companies in New Zealand I want to get involved with? The first thing I think about is like, where can I actually be helpful? So if my background on growth could, for example, with Crimson, it made sense that I felt like there were places I could add value there. And then from there, I'd say most of what I've done it tends to be consumer facing. So I tend to lean more towards consumer facing companies. And I've done a lot of stuff in the health and wellness space, like Whoop and Zwift and others. And being a kind of endurance athlete myself, that's just a space that I'm personally passionate about. So that and ed tech is a space I've also started to get a bit more involved with.
So how do you think about this? Traditionally, New Zealand hasn't had a lot of direct to consumer companies, right? Most the ones at least that are well known are either deep tech or B2B SaaS, like Xero and Rocket Lab. How do you think about? And I mean, my opinion is that part of it is that New Zealand isn't quite far away from big consumer markets like the United States. How do you think about founders who are building direct to consumer businesses from New Zealand? What do you think? Is there a way to do it from New Zealand, or do they have to move to the States?
I don't think you need to move to the States. I think especially these days, you can start any company from anywhere in the world, I think, right? So, I mean, there may be certain things where if your target market is in the States, it's easier to start off living if you live in the States, but just trying to think. I mean, Crimson Education is a great example of a company that was able to build a big successful business from New Zealand, a global business. And I don't see any reason why anyone else can't do that.
Mm-hmm. Are there anything that, given your experience with Crimson, anything that you see as especially difficult or especially easy being based here? Are there any advantages and disadvantages to being based here and building a global?
I'd say probably, this may sound silly, but I actually think the biggest challenge and point of friction is just the time zone difference. And, like the having calls, it has to be, like right now it's evening time for me. I'm about to put my kids to bed, and it's morning time for those of you who are in New Zealand. And my triathlon coach actually lives in New Zealand, and it's even hard for us to find times to connect at times. So it's just a logistical thing. But I think that does, his name is Daniel Plews, Plews. He's awesome. So we still, of course, find time to chat, but a lot of it is done more asynchronously, just through, messages on WhatsApp and that kind of thing. I know that if I message him in the morning, I'll hear back from him by the evening.
Nice. Cool. That's great. Anything else you wanted to maybe talk about that we didn't cover? I know you had the presentation, right, which was, I think, I don't know if you want to.
There's a question here, Mark. There's actually a few questions in the chat, Mark, that I don't know if you've been following.
Yeah. Okay. So we have top 5.
We've already kind of covered the K factor.
How can we utilize K factor to increase the consumer product, for example, FMCG products or solutions? Yeah. I mean, I think. Oh, sorry. No, I think, and you were saying the K factor thing matters less now, right?
I think so. I think these days it's actually more about just building a great product. And if you build a great product, then there are so many channels that already exist where people can share that they love that product. Well, for example, even take I was going to say on Twitter and stuff, but even like on TikTok, if you have a great product, I think there's some brands that have figured out how to use TikTok to make things go viral.
Yeah.
I didn't Duolingo. I saw something they've had some things go viral, and you'd think like, well, how does a brand that's like about translating things, like go viral on TikTok? But
yeah,
it just takes like some creativity, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's a question here from Lily, I think. Do you have any solutions in increasing digital capacity, upskilling in New Zealand and creating more tech companies?
Probably hard to say if you haven't been in the country, right?
Yeah, I hope to have a more informed opinion on this once I do actually get to spend some time there. But I would just say, I think what EHF is doing is hopefully going to be a big part of this, and just continuing to not be constricted by the borders, and to have these networks that almost live more in the cloud these days, just like we're all on Zoom right now. So I think by just almost like I feel like the pandemic has made location less relevant, other than the time zone difference that I mentioned. I feel like these days I just have meetings with people all over the place, and half the time I don't even know where they are. But to me, they're all kind of like, there's meetings just like every other meeting. And so I feel like physical geography is a lot less important now than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Thanks for that, Ed. May I just say something very quickly before I have to disappear?
Mm-hmm.
There's currently an Aotearoa digital strategy. Government is working with communities and companies throughout New Zealand to try and find a strategy. And perhaps if you'd like, we could send you a link to that so that you understand more what's going on and how, because we're looking for big players who have been from Silicon Valley and what have you, who have the expertise to help share the expertise, also different investment opportunities. So it might be worthwhile you reading that strategy.
Great, thank you.
There was also a question about sustainability, and given like climate change and stuff, is there a way to discourage consumption to help save resources? Which is sort of the opposite, like similar to your limiting the K factor with the virus, like I guess limiting, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm necessarily have a great answer to that question, but I agree it's important. And so that, the question is, there a way to creatively use virality to discourage consumption? Hold on, let me think just a minute. Well, okay, the first thing that pops in my mind is, in addition to making products go viral, actually the easiest thing to go viral is an idea. And I think it all comes down to how you can package that idea in a way that it's very easy to share with a lot of other people and where they want to share it with others. So if you can package that idea, and when I say package that idea, what does that mean? I don't know. It could mean like create a TikTok video that when people see it, they want to share it. It could mean, it could be a tweet. It could be like any, it almost doesn't matter what the format is, but if it's something that is a shareable piece of content that gets across the message you want to get across, but as importantly, when other people see it, it makes them want to share it as well. I feel like that's the key. Anytime I try to make something go viral, I feel like there are two key elements. One is it's got to be something that the people that use it want to share, and it's got to be something that when it's shared, those people then want to use it.
Yep.
It needs both of them.
I mean, on that note, actually, there's a lot of ideas now that we probably don't want being shared, right? Like there's a bunch of anti-vax stuff and the stuff around the Capitol insurrection. And how do you think about that, right? Do you think the platforms today make it easier for the fringe groups to get mindshare? And is that a problem, or is that just part of the deal?
I mean, sure. I think that's Facebook's been dealing with this. I mean, all the platforms have been dealing with this. And unfortunately, in the past, it's just kind of been whatever content goes viral, and I don't think the platforms have really, I think they've been afraid to like moderate content too much. And so as a result, and a lot of times the more extreme the content is, the more viral it will go, and it can go viral within certain pockets. So I do think that that's just a hard problem that I know Facebook and other platforms are trying to figure out how to solve. And I don't know the answer there, but I agree it needs to be solved.
Nice. How do you think about the metaverse?
I mean, I remember the first time I put on a VR headset, just being blown away by how realistic the thing felt. And then, I reminded myself, we're like at the super early days of all of this. It's like the Pong days of gaming.
Yeah.
Right. So it's hard to even fathom what this will be like 10 years from now, let alone 20 years from now. And so I think the metaverse is going to be a thing. I think there's debate as to will it be like one single metaverse, or will there be multiple kind of universes? I think Sam Lessin wrote a piece on that recently in The Information. Again, this is an area where I don't have a ton of expertise, but I'm fascinated by it. And I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Nice.
But by the way, that's one more thing that's going to, just like the pandemic, almost make physical location less important if people are spending more and more time in the metaverse. I mean, it's to some extent, just having all these meetings on Zoom is a form of the metaverse, right. It's just a very kind of, it's just not a very entertaining and fun version of it, but it's something, the first iteration of it, right?
So given that you have kids, I mean, how do you think about your kids? Like they're going to grow up, they might even grow up most of their time inside of a headset, right? We don't know. How do you think about that? Do you think that's like on the one, do you try to stop them? Do you encourage it? I think Yoav has a kid.
I mean, it's his kid. I think it's kind of scary. And so when the pandemic started, my wife and I decided we would let our kids play Roblox because it was the one way for them to socialize with their friends when they weren't allowed to see them in person. But now that they're able to go to school again, wearing masks and all of that, we've said no more iPad usage. So no more Roblox, no more TikTok. Like, we're trying to hold off on all of that stuff as long as possible. And they do ask to play VR from time to time, but I don't allow much of that either.
Yeah, I mean, when you train on Zwift, right? That's an interesting product, because it's actually you're physically training on a bike, but you have a virtual interface, right? And I think that probably makes you train harder, right?
Yes.
You find that?
Sure. Oh yeah. No, I mean, I do almost all of my bike training indoors on Zwift. It's great. And it's, the most efficient way to train too.
Maybe you can explain about what Zwift is.
Sure. It's basically a virtual world you can ride your bike in from home. I was going to show you, but my camera's blurry right now, but I set up my bike trainer in front of a TV, and I just hop on my bike in my home gym, and I can see myself biking in this virtual world, and I can see other people all over the world that are connected at the same time. So it's another example of like its own little metaverse, I guess. And yeah, it's a great way for me to train and stay in shape. And I like that I don't have to go out and ride on the roads and have traffic lights and cars and all of that stuff to worry about. So for me, it's a great way to stay in shape and not just have to stare at a wall.
Right. Nice.
So, and that's another subscription-based business. It's can't remember, it's like $10 or $15 a month. And again, like when you have a product that people are willing to pay for, even if it's only $10 a month, the numbers can get big pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you think that's kind of the direction things will go with the whole, like, I mean, because we've been talking about the downsides of screens for kids, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, I mean, with kids, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I'm going to have to figure this out. My oldest daughter is 11 and her sister's 9. And then my boys are 6 and 3. So
wow.
I don't think they're, they love their iPads, but my wife and I have been able to like put them away. But I don't know, a few years from now, those of you who have teenagers can maybe tell me how it is, but I know we won't be able to control their screen usage forever.
Cool. That's awesome. I'm assuming there's no last questions. We've gone quite over time, but I just want to say thank you, Ed. That was awesome. And thanks, Mark, for your interviewing skills. It was very good. I hope you all now feel that you know Ed personally enough that you can get in touch with him to talk more. I know he's got a lot of more info that he can talk about on growth and what he thinks are his top 5 tips. So if you do want to get in touch with Ed, I've put his email address in there, and also in the chat I have put his LinkedIn so you can connect with him, and I have put Mark's email address. And also one last thing that I want to share with you is we've got coming up this week some other live sessions that are slightly different. One is post COP26. It's going to be a climate session of 3 hours. We've got another one on innovation, about what should New Zealand be looking at and how do we get from startup into growth phase with our companies. And another one is intergeneration on the rangatahi. So how do we get our youth to have higher salaries and greater job opportunities in the Pacifica and Māori populations of New Zealand. So thanks, Ed, and thanks, Mark. And thank you everyone for showing up, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, Mark. Thanks everyone for joining tonight.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank
See you
you.
soon, guys.